All right, so the simulation is malfunctioning just based off of everything that's happening in the world because everything's insane, but we are plugged into the mainframe. It's Friday afternoon. Welcome to Colonial Outcast, the anti-imperialist podcast your uncle will hate. I'm Greg Stoker, and we're joined by Elena Xenofontos on this special weekend Friday night episode about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. 75 years of endless war, baby. How you doing today?
Oh, yeah, it's great. It's great to be here. It's great to talk about how NATO has brought peace to the world. It's going to be a great conversation. I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking very much forward to this peaceful conversation.
Definitely peaceful. And it's kind of looking like a bit of a joke recently, and I'm not just talking about it because of like Biden's gaffes that he made yesterday.
And now I want to hand it over to the president of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. He's going to beat President Putin.
So if you guys aren't tracking, Joe Biden referred to President Zelensky, who is the president of Ukraine, as President Putin, who is in fact the president of Russia. He also mistook Vice President Donald Trump as Vice President Kamala Harris.
President Kamala Harris.
Yeah. So, and Vice President Donald Trump, she is the baddest of all the vice presidents before her. So he made that gaffe. He also made an off-color joke about Jens Stoltenberg, his wife. Stoltenberg is the head of NATO. I forget what the specifics were, but apparently it had to do with like servicing his wife, or her wife served. It was an off-color joke, and it was super weird. He got a bunch of sympathy laughs, but I didn't pull it up before that. But The Economist, literally just like 30 minutes ago, they dropped this op-ed called "Joe Biden Survives His quote big boy press conference." So apparently Joe Biden held a big boy press conference, as the White House called it, as the NATO summit concluded. So apparently his staffers were calling this a big boy press conference because I guess he wasn't using a teleprompter. He quote sported a tan. It was more lively despite frequently stumbling over his words. So
wait, I'm sorry. Did they actually say sporting a tan? Supporting? What was that now? Could you repeat that? What did they say?
He sported a tan.
Are they serious? Okay.
Yeah.
So he looked nice. Okay, great.
He was nice and sun kissed for the NATO for his big boy press conferences. Honestly, and I made this comment earlier, there's this Benjamin Button effect going on. He's like so old, he's becoming like a child again, where they're saying, "Oh, good job, you didn't use a teleprompter. Who's a big boy?" Like that's just what the world's coming to. But I don't want to focus too much on Biden because we all know it was bad. It's kind of low hanging fruit, so we can kind of move on to NATO. But like being not really into
No, it was definitely worth bringing that up. I was just going to say, there's been a lot of artists that have made some really good little drawings of Trump mixed with Kamala Harris and called it Miss Trump, the vice president of the United States. So people have gotten really creative as well, which has been very entertaining on the internet.
I've seen some horrific AI image of Vice President Kamala Trump. It's kind of like Lovecraftian and it's horror. You feel like you're losing your mind. But what's new? Brilliant. It's 2024. And being not really into empire, we generally take a dim view of NATO. So we really enjoyed the 3-day NATO summit. And before we get into it, we have to do a plug, because if you're new to the channel, or you just stumbled into the random political corner of the internet, we talk about politics quite often, and we're trying to expand into a whole net outlet. We're trying to do merch and the whole thing, but we just completed our first comedy skit, which you can access later tonight on Patreon. It's pretty cool. Here it is.
Makers of Malibu Barbie, Colonial Outcast presents Genocide Barbie. Genocide Barbie gives you the same shallow childhood aspirations as Malibu Barbie, but with the new trendy twist. She's a Zionist.
I'm a brave supporter of Israel's right to exist.
Genocide Barbie comes with all of the basic fallacies to keep your society numb to human suffering.
I really think that these protesters are just looking for something to complain about.
Genocide Barbie comes with all.
Anyways, you can check out that and a lot more exclusive content on our Patreon if you're interested. Also, if not, we do post every single episode for free on like all the other platforms. Anyways, we're back to talking about NATO. I mean, we'll definitely have to bring Israel into it because we're going to talk about Jordan being admitted to NATO. But I think all joking aside, and all genocide Barbies aside, and all pro-war Barbies aside throughout the world, we need to discuss what NATO, because a lot of people are just learning about it for the first time. There's been a mass awakening since this October in the subsequent 8 months, and this is a massive global institution that people need to know about in order to be informed citizens and not be manipulated by the media and what your politicians say. So this is kind of what NATO says it is, and because some people are just learning about it, as I just said, we're going to take the time to talk about how NATO envisions itself, what it trumpets itself as, and then we're going to spend the rest of the episode giving an alternative viewpoint, which is actually the viewpoint that's rooted in fact. So where did my thing go? There we go. All right, so listen, if you go to the NATO website, they go about NATO. So if you're not tracking, NATO was formed in 1949 with the signing of the Washington Treaty. It's a security alliance of 30 countries from North America and Europe. Its fundamental goal is to safeguard the allies of NATO's freedom and security by political and military means. It remains the principal security interests of the transatlantic community and an expression of its common democratic values. So, I mean, we've learned all about Western values since this past October, right? It is impractical means through which the security of the North American and Europe are permanently tied together. NATO enlargement has furthered U.S. goal of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. So enlargement implies that it's trying to grow outside of its own territory. Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, we have to talk about Article 5 because it's going to be brought up, that an attack against one ally is an attack against all, is at the core of the alliance, a promise of collective defense. Article 4 of the treaty ensures consultations among allies on security matters of common interest, which have expanded from a narrowly defined Soviet threat, because, again, it was founded basically ostensibly to guard against USSR incursion into Europe during the Cold War. So it was started off just as a defensive alliance, and now it says Article 4 has expanded to the critical missions in Afghanistan, as well as peacekeeping in Kosovo, and new threats to security, such as cyber attacks, global threats such as terrorism and piracy that affect the alliance and its global network of partners. So, yes, they can expand it to other countries outside of the transatlantic geographical zone whenever, they can find a casus belli or a justification to do so. In addition to its traditional role, the territorial defense of allied nations, here it is, NATO leads the UN-mandated International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, and if you served like me in Afghanistan or Iraq, you saw ISAF forces everywhere, has ongoing missions in the Balkans and the Mediterranean. It also conducts extensive training exercises, offers security support to partners around the globe. We're going to talk about Jordan because they're building a headquarters there, including the EU in particular, but also United Nations, and it's also in Africa. So that, in a nutshell, is what NATO says it is. And you can start to see the problems, even on that propaganda about section. You can start to see kind of red flags for what they really get up to.
Oh yeah, and I think the key thing that a lot of people tend to forget when they think about NATO, they just think about it as a strategic sort of military alliance. They don't seem to realize that it is actually a political alliance as well, because it's supposed to, again, as they actually advocate for themselves, but again, people don't pay attention to that, is that they're a political allegiance, that they're trying to advocate for a certain political agenda, an agenda that of their so-called values, the rules-based order, etc., that they're trying to impose on the rest of the world. So this is basically a coalition of nations that adhere to the same narrative, the same agenda, the same political objectives, and they're trying to expand, aka impose themselves and expand outwards. And in doing so, they're also trying to push a certain political narrative. And then you can connect that, when you connect that with the fact of how closely that NATO essentially works with the United Nations, and it's sort of like the military in essence for the United Nations, it also brings to question the political caliber of the United Nations. And so how it all fits together within the general scheme of imperialism. So you have a military and political allegiance that basically asserts itself globally. And then you also have the United Nations that's also questionable in many ways, but also tends to act as a mouthpiece and advocates for Western so-called values, policies, and Western democracy. So all these things come together to establish an imperial sort of agenda on the rest of the world that everybody has to sort of adhere to. So you can see how when we speak of Western hegemony, this is exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah. And you know, we always have to seem like the good guys. So when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we're going to watch a video by Jens Stoltenberg that was just at the summit from a couple of days ago, where he's basically preaching, in so many words, a doctrine of defensive expansionism. We have to expand NATO into Ukraine to protect the rest of us. You know, it's kind of like medieval. It's like what Charlemagne used to justify some of his wars. You know, we have to we have to expand in order to protect ourselves. It's an old game. Europeans have been arguing this for a long time. Israel does it too. Like, we have to take the Golan Heights to secure ourselves. Like, we don't want to, but we have to for our own security, because Russia's a bad, irrational actor, so forth, so on and so forth. So here's a clip of that argument being phrased in a way that is appealing to a Western audience.
The most critical task at this summit will be everything we will do and decide on Ukraine. Because this is really the time where we are tested. If we want to stand up for democracy and freedom, it's now, and the place is Ukraine. I expect that the NATO leaders will agree a substantial package for Ukraine. There are fundamentally 5 elements in that package. One is that we will establish a NATO command for Ukraine to facilitate and ensure training and delivery of security assistance to Ukraine. But of course, action speaks louder than words. So in addition to the language in the declaration on membership, which again is important, I think that what we actually do together with Ukraine is as important. And therefore, the fact that we now have a NATO framework, we'll have a NATO framework around the support. The fact that we have a long-term NATO commitment when we agreed the pledge, and also the fact that we actually are delivering more weapon systems to Ukraine. All of that is helping Ukraine to become closer to NATO, to come closer to NATO membership.
Okay, and real quick, I just want to. We're going to get to this in a bit, but one of the key pillars of this plan he has is weapons going to Ukraine, and we're going to see how they're actually not being very effective. So, just to continue.
I strongly believe that when the fighting stops, we need to ensure that Ukraine has the capabilities to deter future aggression from Russia, and they need security guarantees. And of course, the best and strongest security guarantee will be Article 5. So therefore, I believe that
Article 5, again, says if you attack one of us, you attack all of us.
A way to ensure that it stops is actually NATO membership.
Okay, so what do you think? This is kind of a rhetorical question here. Do you think NATO membership will halt Russian aggression? Do you think that's the way to end this seeming forever war, this grinding war of attrition?
Well, that's the thing, right? So when you sit down and think about it, already NATO has been involved in Ukraine for such a lengthy period of time. So if you sit down and break it like, well, if you basically break it down, you have Operation Orbital that began from the UK intelligence in 2014, that was basically training and working with the Ukrainian military. You also have Canadian forces that were also training the Ukrainian military from 2015, 2016 onwards. And then you also have, I think I remember reading a fantastic report by Jacques Baud, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. If I'm not, I apologize to all the French speakers. He's a Swiss intelligence sort of analyst who was working for NATO, and he was actually based in Ukraine from 2014. And he wrote a fantastic report himself, documenting the extent, basically, that NATO was involved in training and facilitating of the Ukrainian military from 2014 onwards. So obviously, this was done at the time in using all these other avenues and ways of training, but Ukraine was very much still involved with NATO anyway. So if you sit down and think about it from that angle, it really wouldn't make a difference, because at the current, when you actually look at it objectively, NATO is actually was very much involved in Ukraine. It trained Ukrainian military. It armed Ukraine. It provided lethal weapons to Ukraine, and it didn't really make a difference. And then without wanting to sort of immediately get into the technical military aspect of why that wouldn't work, because we said we can discuss that a little bit later. For me, it doesn't make any sense to say that Ukraine would have been protected if it was part of NATO, because the outcome would still be the same today, based on what I've just said.
Yeah, and this idea that we're just going to keep sending weapons to Ukraine, that like the cusp of victory is just around the corner. We've seen legacy media or MSM, mainstream media, keep pushing this narrative. Like every once in a while, The Economist will put out an article like, "Newsflash: Russian ruble about to collapse. Sanctions having an effect." Well, none of this has happened. Russia hasn't been weakened by the Western sanctions. In fact, they've expanded. They've strengthened their allegiance with like China, and now the overtures to North Korea have happened. They've kind of pushed them into a different diplomatic space that is more advantageous to Russia because of NATO's behavior, because of NATO's trying to dominate everything through hard power means, economic sanctions and the waging of these proxy wars. And even last year, like Russia has, of course, gained ground in the Donbass region. They have primary control over 4 oblasts, like provinces that Ukraine once, in the opening stages of the war, was conducting successful operations and taking ground, and then they've completely lost that. They've completely lost the initiative. But we've seen cracks starting to form even last year in the ongoing war effort in Ukraine.
The foreign ministers will discuss.
Yeah, I was going to
sustain and step up the support for Ukraine, both the military support, the economic support, and of course also impose economic sanctions on Russia. And we do that not least because we know that it will be a tragedy for the Ukrainians if President Putin wins, but also dangerous for us, because the message sent to all authoritarian leaders in Moscow, but also in Beijing, will be that when they use military force, when they invade another country, they get what they want, and therefore we will be more vulnerable if President Putin wins, and therefore it is in our security interest to support Ukraine.
But President Putin, to some extent, is winning this war because he's inflicting pain in Ukraine. And when you look at support to Ukraine, that has been falling and falling and falling. We have not seen a more financial support to Ukraine, huge question marks about military support too. There was a comment from a Ukrainian pilot saying that they're not going to see those fighter jets this winter.
Well, first of all, I think we have to remember where we started. When this war started in February last year, most experts, and also here at NATO, we feared that Ukraine would collapse in weeks and that Russia will take control over Kiev within days. That didn't happen. The Ukrainians have been able to push them back in the north, in the east around Kharkiv, and in the south around Kherson. And they have liberated roughly 50% of the territory that Russia occupied at the beginning of the war. And on top of that, they have inflicted heavy losses on Russia. this is a big win for Ukraine. Ukraine has prevailed as a sovereign, independent nation, but we should not underestimate Russia. They are putting their economy on war footing. They are sending in more troops and forces. So we must sustain our support to Ukraine. And I welcome the US leadership on this. The US has been leading in providing support. But it is also an important message that almost half of the military support is coming from Canada and European allies. So this is not US alone. This is actually North America and Europe together providing support to Ukraine.
Okay, so that was a year ago, and all the ground that they said they've made, they've lost, and yeah, they haven't weakened Russia. Or sorry, you had a comment?
Yeah, I had a lot of comments to say about what he just said. So there's a lot of things to break down, because actually when you look at his speech that he gave, even at this summit, he pretty much reiterated the same points. The narrative hasn't really changed. And there's some things that are very important to understand. So the first thing is that they constantly reiterate this point to prove that NATO Ukraine has actually come out in some way victorious, because if it wasn't for NATO support, that Kiev would have fallen within 3 weeks, et cetera, et cetera. Anybody who was following the diplomatic situation that was basically breaking out at the end of 2021, all the way into 2022, Russia didn't want this war to begin with. And they sure as hell didn't want to conquer all of Ukraine and want to take over Kiev. What they wanted to do was to try to improve their negotiating power, let's just say, in order to coerce Ukraine to accept that they were going to be politically neutral. That's why they were trying to get a deal in as soon as possible, which is why there was a deal, draft deal agreed upon within the first 3 weeks. Because what Russia really wanted, and what they said initially, which now no longer stands, was the implementation of Minsk II, which basically means that Ukraine would have kept its territorial integrity but established a federal state, and to establish political neutrality with security guarantees coming from both Russia and the United States. This was essentially this is what Russia wanted. So when they went in initially, it was to sort of power play and improve their negotiating power on the table. So it was never really about conquering all of Ukraine. Economically speaking, politically speaking, imagine taking over all of Ukraine. They wouldn't be able to sustain something like that. So that was never really part of the agenda.
Yeah,
and then I'll let you say what you're saying.
And just one point, that they didn't send in enough ground forces to actually make that viable at the start.
Around Kiev, they had 40,000 ground forces, and against 100,000 Ukraine. Of course, they didn't want to take Ukraine. It was never about taking Kiev. It was just about getting a certain result. That was always the case. But the way that this argument is always formulated, or rather presented to the public in Western mainstream media and through the Western political class, is that no, they want to conquer all of Ukraine in order to give Ukraine an artificial victory, in order to present Russia in a way that they somehow lost, and therefore present the NATO aspirations as being something that's plausible. So it's very interesting to see, and it's very interesting that they're still pushing that narrative to show, like, see, we've accomplished something, when actually they didn't. And then from that point, when I think Russia realized, and when you sort of study everything that's been going on within 2 years, and you look at the Russian political class, they went from, we want the Minsk agreements, to now they've kind of completely abandoned that. And what they've essentially looking at is they really are going to end up keeping all of Eastern Ukraine, because for them, Eastern Ukraine is the most geostrategically important aspect of Ukraine, because it's right next to the Black Sea, which is where all of Russia's main trade routes are. It's warm water port all year round, and it's where its main military fleet is, and where its security is based. So once they've secured Eastern Ukraine, they really couldn't care at all about the rest of Ukraine. And people like Stoltenberg, they're aware of this, but they keep feeding the Western public misinformation in order to delude the masses into believing that there's something victorious about continuously funding Ukraine, when it's really a failing project. And then the other aspect behind it that I find absolutely amusing is that throughout this year, I think it was even a couple of months ago, that I think Ukraine even published an advertisement, and the advertisement is, if we fall, Germany's next. And there's this, I wish I had published it on my former Instagram, but that's been deleted now. But it was basically a huge ad with Russia bombing the center of Berlin in order to terrorize sort of Europeans into supporting Ukraine. But then I think I even sent you this. There was an article published by the New York Times, and in that New York Times article, I think it was on the 1st of July, there was a small little paragraph that essentially said that most senior US officials and intelligence personnel agree that Putin doesn't seem to exhibit any desire to extend the war beyond Ukraine, that he just literally wants to deal with that. But yet when the political class comes out, or Stoltenberg comes out, they constantly are pushing this narrative to the Western public that if Ukraine falls, it's the end of NATO. It's the end of us all. We're going to fall at the mercy of Putin, who's going to take over the world, and it's so apocalyptic, the narrative that they use in order to somehow influence. Yeah,
we've been learning a lot about how. A lot of people have been learning about how propaganda operates since October again. So I think if you want to look for a through line here between justifying intervention in the Middle East and justifying this war in Ukraine, you can say, like, if Russia isn't defeated here, they're going to come and invade Europe. If we don't fight terrorism in the Middle East, it's going to come back and there's going to be terrorist attacks in Europe and America. I mean, it's not very sophisticated. It's literally the same. It's like same template, different verbiage,
That's true.
So
like Hamas is going to come after all of us, you know what I mean? All these Islamic terrorists are going to come and kill us all, so we need to we need to sort of suppress them and get rid of them as soon as possible. Yeah, I get it. I completely agree. It's the same sort of ideological reasoning.
Yeah, I mean, it's what I'm painting in broad strokes as imperial propaganda. Again, this idea of like defensive expansionism in a way. Like, we want to expand, but we can't say that. So we're going to manufacture consent. And, we did an episode on think tanks and all of that last time as well.
It is manufacturing consent. And there's something else that I actually want to bring to your attention, because we're talking about redefining the narrative. I was actually reading from the New York Times, and it's sort of something that was echoed in the NATO summit. How now the West is sort of trying to orchestrate a Ukrainian victory. If we look at from the beginning of the war in Ukraine up until, I would say, probably a few months ago, the narrative was that Ukraine is going to gain back all its territories. And I remember last year they had the so-called spring offensive that was delayed to become the summer offensive. And then that whole project, it was so pumped up by Biden and the West and NATO that they had built up this huge Ukrainian offensive that's going to push and expel the Russians. And they're even going to take back Crimea, and it's going to force the Russians to come to the negotiating table as a weak party. Now it's been completely changed. I was reading an article from the New York Times, and now senior Western officials, and they kind of reiterated the same point in the NATO summit, they're stating that they've kind of said Ukraine is not going to get any territory back. But the good thing is that Russia is taking more territory. But as I've already said, that's not really what Russia's goal is. But now the main focus of the war is Ukraine's going to become a part of NATO and also part of the EU, neither of which are plausible. It's going to be difficult for them to enter to enter NATO, and it's going to be even more difficult for them given the current economic realities of the European Union, which is on the brinks of a massive economic collapse, to actually be able to allow for another member state who's in economically a very dire situation to enter this economic union. So apparently now they're redefining a victory for Ukraine, and that is EU membership and NATO membership, and basically the loss of Eastern Ukraine. So the way that they redefine things in order to shape the narrative and to sort of amplify NATO's presence is always very, very interesting.
Again, there's an easy corollary there, part of the umbrella of what I call imperial propaganda. What did Israel say its strategic goals were at the onset? It was going to defeat every last inch of Hamas. It was going to completely destroy Hamas. Now what's the narrative shifting to? They've been dismantled. Oh, it's not dismantled. They can't dismantle it. Okay, now we're shifting to their capacity, their operational capabilities have been reduced to such a point that October 7th can never happen again. So they keep moving the goalposts when they can't achieve what they thought they could achieve. There has been this, I think there's been this shock recently, since the withdrawal of from Afghanistan and the onset of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and now they're trying to do a geopolitical shift, geostrategic shift to East Asia and Taiwan. That's really not working out, but that's beyond the scope of this episode. But I think they're shocked because they don't have the same power that they thought they had. So they keep using these things that have demonstrably been proven to not work, like sanctions, like a proxy army that doesn't have like a lot of institutional history to it, like the Ukrainian army. And even though the Russian military at the onset of the war had huge problems, but it was still like a massive establishment trying, like one thing, the proxy thing, trying to fight an established military. That didn't work. Sanctions don't work. It's like, but they keep doubling down on everything because they don't have any other options. They can't think creatively enough, or they don't know what else to do. So since that doesn't work, they have to then use this propaganda machine to move the goalposts and kind of gaslight everybody into thinking that what is actually strategically a defeat is kind of like a lucky victory, something like that. And also, oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead, finish your thought process.
No, and that's just one of the aspects, this territorial conquest. But like a lot of this is over the Donbass, and Russia doesn't seem willing to like give that up anymore. Like maybe they were willing to at the beginning of the war, because they don't really have to. And there's a lot of mineral wealth in the Donbass. I think we do have and I just wanted to bring this up before we move on. We do have Senator Lindsey Graham legitimately saying the quiet part out loud last month. Oh yeah. And it was just straight up like, yeah, we know, dude. We know this is a huge factor when it comes to us trying to retake the Donbass and control, and they want NATO to control Ukraine. You cannot factor in any imperial endeavor without addressing mineral extraction.
If we help Ukraine now, they can become the best business partner we ever dreamed of. That $10 to $12 trillion of critical mineral assets could be used by Ukraine and the West, not given to Putin and China. This is a very big deal how Ukraine ends.
Right there.
Mm-hmm. The thing is with that as well, the interesting point. So beyond the mineral wealth that Eastern Ukraine has, it also is the industrial part of all of Ukraine. It's basically the eastern part of Ukraine has all the major cities outside of Kiev. All the biggest cities, all the most popular urban cities are in eastern Ukraine. The majority of the Ukrainian population was in eastern Ukraine, and it was the industrial powerhouse of Ukraine. And that is actually historically rooted in the fact that the eastern part of Ukraine became part of Ukraine only in the 1920s, when it was given to Ukraine by Lenin. It was actually a part of Russia, and it was given to Ukraine in order to industrialize, because otherwise Ukraine would have been an agricultural economy, and it wouldn't have been able to sort of aspire to the kind of socialist system that they were trying to create at the time. So they needed that industrial capacity. So a lot of the industrial sector in eastern Ukraine is actually built, facilitated by Russians. So that's another aspect. That's a lot of money. Also the nuclear power that's there, which is, again, a lot of it was and established by Russia that they weren't willing to lose in this war as well. When it comes to the mineral resources, I think it's probably the least of Putin's interest or Russia's interest, just because for Russia specifically, they're very rich in mineral resources themselves. So that's not something I think Russia's particular goal here is probably the industrial sector, the Black Sea, which is, like I said before, it's key to all its trade routes, its security, yeah, these are the most significant aspects. But we know for the Western powers, the mineral resources that Ukraine has are very significant in eastern part of Ukraine, among other, let's say, virtues.
Yeah, I'm trying to think what. I think what the West really wants, it needs high up on the tier of high priority minerals is lithium, and there is supposedly huge reserves in the Donbass. And, I think they're trying to make some inroads into Bolivia for those lithium reserves. But again, that's beyond the scope of that. Like, we need some lithium, y'all. And there's some in the Donbass. So, yes.
The thing is that I was going to say is, but I don't know if you want to get into it now. There's two main objectives when it comes to the continuation right now of the war. So, I mean, we're looking at the military structure. We're looking at the fact that the West, NATO, have now made all these new packages and aid, military aid that's going to be given to Ukraine, etc. All of which are not going to work. They're not, which I don't know if you want to get into now. So we can break into, first of all, the military miscalculation that they really thought that Russia was going to fall. And there was a great article by Wall Street Journal that I think is really worth discussing that just came out, discussing that said miscalculation and the sort of Western modus operandi, or rather the doctrine, that Western military doctrine that's proven to not actually work in Ukraine. And then the other aspect is, of course, the military industrial complex and the financial elite, and how for them, this is generating a lot, trillions in profits. And these are, so it might appear to us to be a huge miscalculation. I think to an extent it was, but at the end of the day, the capitalist class is still making short-term massive gains in Ukraine.
Yes. Okay. So first of all, at the outbreak of the war, there were some promising signs, at least on a superficial level, that the Russians were eventually going to be defeated. They had some structural problems, the military. I'll get into that in a second. I'm talking about like the opening 2 months here. They hadn't really fought a large scale engagement. They were fighting in different territories. Some of the Russian soldiers didn't even, they thought that they were on a training exercise. They didn't even know that they were deploying into combat. This is not necessarily unprecedented in past Russian military actions either. They had that massive armored column coming down from the north to south towards Kiev. They had massive logistical supply issues. They ran out of fuel. So they were stuck there for days just getting sniped. They lost field grade officers. They lost a ton of general officers because they didn't have a strong non-commissioned officer corps in the Russian army. And so a lot of people were like, oh, conscript army, like, look at this. Like they have scavenged like motherboards on their tanks. Like, look at all this low tech stuff. Well, 2 years later, I mean, those things did happen and they looked wildly incompetent. But 2 years later, they've restructured a lot of this stuff. We're no longer seeing general officers like colonels and brigadier generals getting sniped because they're no longer on the front lines, because they've developed, at least from the outside, like a competent company grade officer and non-commissioned officer corps. They've kind of revamped how they do things. They're not having the same supply issues, at least not on the scale they were at the beginning. And so that's changed. But based off of a couple of like failures, which do happen in military campaigns, but I mean, they weren't great, but it's changed from what it was 2 years ago, and they changed rapidly. So that's just the superficial analysis that like people were doing on CNN. You'd have these like General Petraeus, who's like, like this, they can't even sort out their logistics. It's like, okay, well, cool, Petraeus, you're a very problematic person. We're not even going to get into that, but that's all. That it was just this really superficial military analysis. They weren't there. It was that combined with them talking about how the ruble was going to collapse, and then because they had they had like the GDP of New Jersey, they couldn't.
Like that. Texas. Texas. You should know this. You're from Texas. It was from the same GDP as Texas. It was the same narrative reiterated all the time.
Yeah. And so it was that the media push was basically just honing in on specific Russian military failures, and then their GDP size. Well, 2 years later, they're still going after it. And now they're one thing that Russia's never hurt for is manpower. Well, Ukraine's having a manpower shortage. The average like fighting soldier is in their early 40s. That's not great. There's over 600,000 Ukrainians of draft age that do not want to come back to Ukraine because they're going to get drafted. And so they're having all these other problems. But one of the things that we can control, like the West can't give them more men. They can't fix a lot of the problems they have. All we can do is give them more high-tech weapons. And everyone's thought that, West, like we have the Cadillac stuff. Our weapons are the best. Our precision-guided missiles and everything we're going to send them is the bestest stuff, gear, swag you can get. Well, it turns out that everybody kind of knows that, yes, high-tech American weapons work against Russia until they don't, because there's actually a window of opportunity when introducing new technology to the battlefield. It will work within a certain period of time, and then the enemy will adapt. And a lot of the precision weapons take years and years to develop and they're hugely expensive. So the defense contractors who are getting these R&D contracts to research and develop new stuff that can counter Russian electronic warfare capacities are making a ton of money, but like every time they produce and roll out something new, Russia's able to counter it quickly. So at least, as you said, the capitalist class is making money, but Moscow is learning how to defeat Western precision munitions in Ukraine. It says according to a report by the Wall Street Journal, it says that within weeks, the Russian army started to adapt to a lot of these precision weapons, like the Excalibur artillery round, which is a guided GPS round. It hits tanks and artillery with surgical precision. But Russia started to counter the guidance packages on the warheads with EW capabilities, electronic warfare, and each one is eventually countered. So yes, we can keep sending them all of these fancy weapons, but weapons that can be eventually countered, they don't take ground. They don't hold objectives. You need men to do that on the most basic level. The only thing that can secure an objective is boots on the ground. So that's the only thing the Western media, and if you watch the NATO summit, all that everybody was talking about was like, we're sending them more F-16s. Great, fighters can't take ground. We're sending more ATACMs, more like rocket artillery. Great, those also can't take ground. So like when you say you're going to kick the Russians out of the Donbass on a very basic level, when you get through all the superficial talking points, I'm just like, how?
No, it doesn't make any sense. This is the thing. So there's another, I thought this was a brilliant article for so many different reasons. So, I mean, it discusses the whole Western military doctrine of target precision can defeat mass. So the idea that these electronic GPS target missiles you don't need men, you don't need tanks, you don't need as much artillery, as long as you can target precision attack wherever is necessary, and you can defeat that said enemy, let's just say. I think it says retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. He actually made a point that I actually remember stating exactly the same thing about 2 years ago when this war began. This doctrine worked when we were dealing with Saddam Hussein, when we're dealing with the Taliban, when we're dealing with very weak sort of guerrilla sort of warfare, or parties that didn't really have anything to work against these sort of high-tech target precision attacks. Whereas Russia and China, because they're referencing both Russia and China, and even in this NATO summit, there was a huge attack on China, but we'll get into that in a second. But Russia and China are peers in the sense of these are also powerful military countries with powerful military structures and high-tech capabilities and industrial capacity to be able to produce. So they are very fast able to find the ways that these sort of high-tech target precision missiles work and be able to counter that. And what is that this war has actually proven is that the good old sort of unguided artillery shells are the way forward. Basically having, like you said, boots on the ground, ammunition and tanks. This is the way that a war can be defeated, especially when you're dealing with someone that is equally, let's just say, as powerful as you. And in fact, I remember I can't remember if it was in 2022 or 2023, CNN was even discussing how in the West, we have a huge sort of ammunition shortages. And they were actually stating, again, it was on the CNN, and I think the anchor was even shocked that Russia was using up to 60,000 shooting up to 60,000 shells a day, and in the West we're only able to produce somewhere between 30,000 shells a month, artillery shell a month. And they said that they were going to sort of slowly begin to increase the production over the next 4 years to 60,000 a month. But then you've got Russia using that much within a day. And then when we sort of contextualize that, it's going to be very difficult for Western industrial capacity to be able to make up that kind of level of production anyway, because they deindustrialized about 30 years ago, because Western capitalism has become more finance-based rather than industrial produced.
Yeah. And also, that is a great point. Yes, going into finance capitalism, that is definitely one factor in why we don't have the same output like we had in the Second World War or Korea, or like even Vietnam.
Up to 30 years ago. Up to 30 years ago.
So another aspect is how the military industrial complex, as a completely capitalist enterprise that goes for where the money is, it's not, when you're talking about large sums of like returns, that doesn't just end when a conflict ends. You want the F-35 contract. You want, because that's going to last decades, right? You don't want to build the capacity to mass produce tank shells that may never be used. In 20 years of the global war on terror, which was a low intensity, well, for the most part, characterizing it all as low intensity is really not it's super reductive and not necessarily true in all cases. But a low intensity counterinsurgency, well, the military industrial complex, because that's what's paying, that's what's getting rewarded with these contracts, is going to shift towards counterinsurgency, not fighting against armies that have fighter craft, that have artillery shells, that have tanks. It's going to be against like how to find and fix insurgents and destroy insurgents. So that's another reason why the U.S. and military industrial complex cannot compete with Russian and Chinese output right now, because it's completely shifted from third generation peer versus peer, state versus state warfare towards this state versus non-state actor stuff. So that's something nobody wanted to talk about when this war first started 2 years ago.
Exactly. And that's why in the article, they're speaking about so-called miscalculation. And what that's essentially led to now is the realization that, like we said, old school sort of weaponry and approaches to military is the way forward, especially to deal with Russia. So all these fancy weapons, etc., that they're sending are not going to work. Not to mention, I think we discussed this in private, that even to use, like Antony Blinken at the summit was boasting that by this summer, which made, now basically we're going to see F-16s in the skies of Ukraine. Not to mention the degree of training that you need, that the Ukrainian military, which is like the fourth round of military, because so many Ukrainians have been killed at this point, don't even have the basic training to be able to use the kind of F-16. So I don't see how successful they're going to be in being able to sort of use this kind of these F-16s to bring any sort of positive result. It's not going to make a change. It's just some sort of grand statements made at NATO to show what. And then whilst all of Europe is basically sending over their weapons, and this is another thing I was reading today, I think it only was yesterday, that the Danish minister, she basically said that they want to send all of the country's air defense systems to Ukraine. The same thing has been occurring in Germany over the last 2 years, in the Netherlands. So you've got a European the European Union or European countries that have become completely demilitarized. They're basically giving away all their weapons. Even Cyprus has given up a huge chunk of their weapons because Victoria Nuland was here giving us orders that we have to give our weapons to Ukraine. So everybody's been giving everything over to Ukraine. And who's going to be making money off of it? The military industrial complex, who's now coming and say, we're going to be producing new upgraded versions of this. Even the F-16s are trying to sort of they're basically trying to sort of get rid of them. They're kind of, I don't know, they're upping up their systems, etc. So they're basically giving things away, mass producing new high-end, updated military equipment and weapons and ammunition that they're going to sell, which is going to make a shit ton of money. Sorry, excuse my French. Sorry. And then you've got, I think it was in. Yeah, but like then you've got the NATO summit. You got the US basically made an order to Germany that they need to start producing long-range missiles, and then I think not Denmark, the Netherlands as well. They've committed something like 20 billion or not 20 billion, 20 million to fund drones or something, to the creation, like the manufacturing of drones for attack drones for Ukraine. So this is now, I mean, who's going to make this? The military industrial complex. So this is all the money that this is generating for the capitalist elite class. This is essentially what the only thing that's coming out of this. For Ukraine, it's game over.
Yeah. And, you know, so one article or one development that just happened earlier today, this is coming out of Ukraine, like from a couple hours ago. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who arrived in Washington for the NATO summit, previously said that Ukraine could use British Storm Shadow missiles to strike military targets deep inside Russia. However, today, the UK denied this a day after the summit. The Telegraph reported, quote, Britain has been forced to clarify it has not given permission for Ukraine to use storm shadows to strike inside Russia in an awkward diplomatic moment for Sir Keir Starmer. So, yeah,
Been a few days already.
Yeah, they don't want to escalate with Russia. It doesn't seem. Yet they can say like Ukraine's gonna, join NATO all they want, but that's a problem for another day. They don't want to escalate immediately by sending massive Storm Shadow missiles to strike deep inside Russia. They're completely content to just keep this contained inside Ukraine because I don't know, maybe like serving the military industrial complex is like a chief policy goal. It's almost weird how that works. So
yeah, it's just a strange little coincidence. It's a strange little coincidence.
So I don't expect this war to end anytime soon.
Yeah, and we often discuss like the state of Ukraine and like the West. There's been some who've argued that it's going to be a frozen conflict. I have a bit of a different opinion there. I don't know how to define if it's going to be a frozen conflict. I just think that things are going to stay the way it is. As in, it's taken what it's taken, for better or for worse. It's established for its own security interests, whether it's economic, political, military. And I think that's just that. And unfortunately for Ukraine, this situation is going to keep going. The country is going to completely collapse. It's basically, like I said before, it's become a colony of NATO. It's become a colony of the West. It's never going to get inducted into the European Union because of its dire economic situation and military situation and political situation. Because beyond all the money that the military industrial complex is making, then you have all these the financial capitalist class like JP Morgan, etc., who have given out all these loans to Ukraine, that was interest-free until October of 2024, but that now they're coming and saying it will no longer be interest-free, and already it looks like Ukraine is going to default. This is not a country that's going to be admitted into the EU. All this narrative, all this diagnosis that has been put forward through the NATO summit, it was just a Hollywood-esque show, and the reality is Ukraine is just going to be stuck in this endless forever war, as the great Julian Assange said, who's now free. It's an endless forever, who's now free, an endless forever war where money's going to get laundered through Ukraine. They're going to be generating mass profits for the military industrial complex. The financial elite are going to be pumping money because money creation comes from debt, and the Ukrainian people and Ukraine as a country will be completely, it's very sad. It's going to be completely destroyed. And I find I think it's just very sad, to be honest with you. And all of this could have been avoided.
Yeah, and I don't at this point, I don't really care where you stand on the conflict. Two things you need to realize is like there was a diplomatic solution, and this could end anytime generally. But it won't. So there's that. So in terms of like NATO colonies, deep NATO strategic partners of NATO, we need to talk about.
We have to use the terminology.
Yeah, right. A deep strategic partner. The another development shifting to the Middle East, which is not in the transatlantic territories, by the way, if you hadn't noticed. The Jordanian Foreign Ministry confirmed the opening of a NATO liaison office in Jordan, in Amman, yesterday, saying in a statement that the office was established to foster cooperation with the alliance. It's like, I have friends who military friends who trained in Jordan and went through the foreign area operations course, foreign area officer course. I went through Ranger School in Fort Benning, Georgia, with Jordanian officers. It's like, it seems like we already have pretty good military cooperation, but apparently we need more. So we're going to get into possible reasons for that. This decision represents a milestone in the deep strategic partnership between Jordan and the alliance. Okay, so emphasizing the evolving regional and global security landscape. The global security landscape, it's evolving, right? Allies at the 2024 NATO Summit in Washington adopted an action plan for a stronger, more strategic and result-oriented approach towards its southern neighborhood. This is the language they use in the press statement, their southern neighborhood. So the plan clearly demonstrates NATO's commitment to reinforcing engagement and cooperation with its partners in the Middle East and North Africa. This is like something you would expect from like the British Foreign Ministry in like the 1870s. Honestly, it's not great.
I mean, they picked that up from somewhere, you know, like it's something that's been learned historically, but yeah.
So Oman has long-standing cooperation bonds with NATO, if you guys weren't tracking, and has deployed troops to serve alongside forces in Kosovo, Afghanistan, Libya. The country also, as you guys know, has close ties to Israel, which is kind of like a NATO stepchild, little NATO stepchild over there. So during Iran's Operation True Promise in mid-April, in which the Islamic Republic fired hundreds of drones and missiles at Israel in response to the destruction of its consulate, the Hashemite monarchy opened its airspace to Israeli jets and played a significant role in intercepting Iranian missiles. So if you guys aren't tracking, several Western nations, including the U.S., obviously, have military bases in Jordan. So what do you think, Alina, is behind this heightened, deep strategic partnership with their southern neighbor?
Oh, this heightened, newfound relationship that is being created. I mean, truthfully, it's to be honest, for me, it's even a formality at this point, because as you've just very rightly highlighted, it's something that has been ongoing anyway, but it's supposed to be like, for me, it acts more so as a formality to sort of reestablish NATO and Western influence in the region, not as if it wasn't already there in the first place. I could get into a little bit more. I have some more things to add, but I want to pass it back on to you before I do, because sometimes I can just go on a little one and derail the conversation.
Do you think, again, this may be a bit of a rhetorical question. If you want to rant, you can go rant, but I'll just like to direct your rant. Do you think this has anything to do with Israel at all?
Well, of course, it has everything to do with Israel. Jordan has been the single. No, but it's true. Jordan has proven itself to be the biggest splinter. Jordan and Egypt, for me, have been the biggest splinter to the Palestinians in the region, and the greatest tools used by the West to suppress the Palestinians since 1948, but especially since October 7th. I mean, even recently, as we've discussed this before in one of our previous podcasts about how China and Russia are trying to basically unite Fatah and Hamas into a singular Palestinian sort of governing force that would completely sort of counter the Palestinian Authority and sort of diminish Israel's claims that, you know, Hamas can no longer rule because they're going to basically infiltrate Hamas into another governing source. So Russia and China have been working in on this, which has been, for me, a very interesting sort of development. And then who apparently, so I think it was end of June, there was supposed to be a meeting that was going to be conducted by China in China with Fatah and the Hamas. And who was the party that prevented that, or prevented the Palestinian Authority, gave them specific instructions: do not go to China, do not engage in talks about union with the other Palestinian factions. Oh, it was the Jordanian monarchy. Again, so they're the ones that got involved. This was just like literally a week or two ago, and now you've got the NATO headquarters opening up in Jordan. They're essentially Israel's biggest partner and ally in the entire region, and only, I think it was a couple of days ago now, apparently China said that this meeting is back on, but it hasn't been confirmed where. So the Palestinian Authority has now basically said that actually they are considering going to China to have this meeting with Hamas. But the very fact that the Jordanian monarchy got involved to present something which is significant for the Palestinian people, and that's union, you bring together all the factions under a single source, is really telling us to where Jordan lies in the greater scheme of things, and specifically when it comes to the Palestinian Israeli, rather the colonial project that is known as Israel, and it's basically its greatest ally.
Yep. And so, you know, kind of, I definitely agree with everything you're saying. So since October, everyone's been saying like this talking point, like Israel's our greatest strategic ally in the region. And I just want to be like, sure, it's not Jordan. Like, really?
Yeah. Yeah, Jordan, people don't understand the significance of the Jordanian monarchy. And I always have to remind people the Jordanian monarchy was put there strategically in 1921 by the British. They're actually of Saudi descent, and they were placed there as a proxy. They're a Western proxy. And whenever the Jordanians have tried to retaliate historically against the monarchy, Israel and the UK would suppress rebellion against the monarchy in Jordan because they wanted the Jordanian monarchy to exist, because the Jordanian monarchy has been the greatest ally for Israel and the West in Western Asia. And nobody ever addresses this.
Yeah. And so when we see, when we talk about, colonialism, neo-colonialism, it doesn't even seem neo, because it's just like right out of the old playbook. You install a monarchy that's beholden on you for its defense and its financial support, and they will do your dirty work in the region. So just circling back, this NATO liaison office just formalizes what has always existed for quite some time now. So basically, just to wrap up, we've talked about like how NATO styles itself, what actually is the performative action on the ground, what's just even a cursory, even superficial examination of NATO actions seems to conflict with this idea of a defensive alliance, which was started out to be defensive, but they can have contingency operations, and even the language that's being used in modern press statements, if you've studied like post-colonial studies at all, it's deeply colonial. It's literally the same language that the British Foreign Office and political officers in Afghanistan were using in the 19th century. So I just kind of like going on a stream of consciousness for a second. It's like even someone who like studied this in college, it's just wild to see things that like I even thought that this should have existed like in a prior age, like in the pre-World War II world. But it's just kind of mind-boggling. It's literally right there on paper. Like you don't even need to, in some ways, you don't even need to like know anything about Russia and Ukraine. You can just see how they speak about it. It's indecipherable from what was happening 100 years ago. So
yeah, no, it's just like I said when when the podcast began, it's a union which is led essentially, when you look at the financing of it, by the United States to spread through the use of force its own political agenda that served its own imperialist sort of agenda. And there's nothing different to that than the Roman Empire, for example, and which is often glorified by the West in many ways. And as well, another thing is that NATO, I'm just saying, that's another, again, beyond the scope of this podcast. I will say, beyond, we can have a little private one about it. I'll say this. NATO also has a need to constantly prove the reason for its very existence, because the moment the Warsaw Pact as well ceased to exist, the existence of NATO was no longer justified. And actually, when the Warsaw Pact basically came to an end, the idea was NATO was then supposed to follow in suit, and it did not. And then since then, it's just constantly been using. It's not a defensive alliance. It's an aggressive. It's an agitating alliance that constantly instigates conflict and then presents itself as the rescuer at the same time, and does this in order to justify that it needs to exist, that it needs to defend the world, when it's actually the one that instigates the conflict. And I will say this, I think we did a segment on Mint Press, and I'm going to clarify, because I made a mistake on that day because I was very stressed out. But actually it was NATO that came first, then the Warsaw Pact. But I was so stressed out that day. I had a bad day, I told you, and I confused the dates. So that was my mistake. I take ownership for that.
Oh my God! You should totally spiral over it. Oh my God! Oh no!
Yeah, I think you realize the type of person I am, Greg. I might just spiral over it, but no. Since its inauguration, it has actually been an alliance that agitates and yeah, but for many Western individuals who haven't looked into the impact that NATO has had, whether it's on, when you look at the former Yugoslavia or Libya, or in the, just the greater geopolitical scene, they won't know that. But the good thing, unfortunately, since October 7th, it's only now people are realizing the flaws in the Western empire, rather.
Yeah. I mean, that's, again, sounding like a broken record, but looking at U.S. foreign policy since October, people are starting to question everything else that the media and these Western institutions are telling them. And yes, NATO, 75 years of waging wars for the top 0.1% of us, and manufacturing enemies abroad, lighting fires in order to justify its own existence. So yeah, before we end, I was gonna play another Biden clip, but I feel bad. It's almost like elder abuse at this point. Like,
oh no, don't feel bad. You know what? I was having this conversation earlier today. I don't feel bad, and I've rationalized it because Biden, even before no, there's a rationality. Okay, it's not cognitive dissonance. This is just pure rationalization. Even prior to Biden, cognitive diminishing state. I mean, Biden has 40 years worth of political history of
being a shitbag,
war hawkishness. Yeah, everything he has, from Libya to Yugoslavia. I mean, his policies, or even the 1994 criminal law in the United States, everything has been absolutely, he's a criminal. So I'm not, just because now he's turning into he looks like a little fragile old man. We must not forget what this man has done and what he's capable of, and what he has, the mark he has left in history. So I do not feel sorry. So you let that, you place that video and let the world enjoy. I was just going to say before we go, I don't know if people, I know this is a little bit off topic, but it's kind of relevant. I don't know if you saw Saudi Arabia threaten the G7, that basically if they're going to, if particularly the European Union tries to appropriate all of Russia's frozen assets, that Saudi Arabia is basically going to sell all of its European government bonds, specifically targeting France because they mostly own French government bonds. And I thought that was an interesting little turnout. So when you've got Jordan setting up headquarters for NATO, I think Saudi Arabia is actually taking a much more stronger stance at this point that seems to be more BRICS orientated than I would have even initially anticipated. I thought that was an interesting development.
I was surprised. Like, I totally got their not re-upping the petrodollar thing and like kind of restoring relations with Iran. But yeah, they're going further in than I thought they would, which is surprising. Yeah, we could talk about that in a later episode. 100%. So the Duffel blog is kind of like the Onion of military news, and this kind of sums up my feelings about Biden right now. President who dropped Afghans from sky asked why you thought Gaza Pier would go any better.
Oh God, the Gaza Pier.
I know. I can't even get into it. So just remember, in closing, thank you guys so much for watching. And this guy is not a victim.
And now I want to hand it over to the president of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. He's going to beat President Putin.
Yeah. Knock him down, Amtrak Joe. Yeah. Give him what for? All right. Anyways, thanks y'all so much for watching. This has been NATO and 75 years of endless war.